meaning it can be close to an actual programming language. No, it is sometimes the basis for programming, but not necessarily the syntax coincide with an actual programming language. Okay, so dili siya actual programming language, but it can be closely connected to a particular programming language. Okay, so for example, ang pseudocode nato karon is naa siya mga conditions, iterations, inputs, and output. Okay, so these are necessary for your program to work, especially if you will be dealing now with an actual programming language. And it has also operators such as assignment, comparison, and arithmetic. So these are the basic operators that you will be using, especially if you'll be going into actual programming na sa C. So you have assignment operator, or you have comparisons, and you have arithmetic. So in here, ang vagueness of some other constructs such as or kanang mga unfamiliarities of other constructs such as ang data type ni mga gamiton, okay? So ang mga means of terminating a particular statements, okay? Grouping of statements are in general not yet included. Okay? So in general, ang gi-include din karon is ang kanang mga basic kaayo nga tools in order for you to write a pseudocode, okay, rather than an formal programming. Now, for example, let's go to a particular example, no? So sa example na to, last meeting, we covered an example that is related to getting the sum of n numbers, okay? Getting the sum of n numbers that are even numbers. Okay? So mao ni karon ang atoang itawag nato nga flowchart. So this is the flowchart of the solution for that particular problem of getting the sum of n even numbers. Okay? So may kag n even numbers in a particular input. So it could be any integer input and you will be getting only the sum of the even numbers. Now, this is the flowchart. Now, let's have a simple conversion from that flowchart into a pseudocode. So, ang pseudocode karon, it can be written in we will do that in Notepad. Okay, so para mas fancy. Instead of showing window, ako na lang i-show stop sharing. Just in the entire screen na lang kay para magbutang na ko side by side. Okay. So, for example, no, we'll be solving this particular problem, no, this problem that we have here using a pseudocode. Okay? So sa atong pseudocode karon, we will follow certain constructs sa ato ang language nga gamiton. Okay, pseudocode. So natay if, natay for, natay while, natay input, natay display, natay assignment operators and comparison operators, and of course you have arithmetic operators. Okay, so muna nga set of syntax ang atong gamiton, but it's not that formal in terms of its kanang semantic formality. So wala siya formality ba nga but pasabot na kung masayop ra ka nga nabutangan nimog dot ba karon mo error na siya dili na mo run. So kani siya karon, it is just simply to visualize the problem that is much more readable as human beings, okay, but not as formal as actual programming. So that is why if you will be going into the advanced field in computer science, makakita mo karon og a lot of pseudocode form very complex algorithm. So gibali ang iyang implementation is very complex, but ang iyang pseudocode is made in such a way that it summarizes the meat of the operation, no? So mao na iyang gihimo. Kay naman goy uban nga mga certain dependencies sa programming language such as iyang object orientedness, kung procedural ba siya karon. So ang iyang pag-implement lahi-lahi labi na sa lain-lain nga languages. So karon ato na siyang hatagan og gibali pseudocode or just a general description. Okay, following this particular syntax. Now, following that syntax, we will be solving that problem. So ang atong problem goes like this. Okay? So get the sum of n inputs that are kanang even. Okay? So get the sum kuno of n inputs that are even. Mao na siya ang ato ang isolve no problem. Now, what we need to do is to have a pseudocode for that. Okay? So sa atong pseudocode, we need to have variables. Okay? So atong mga variables karon ato siya sang i-declare. So sa atong kinahanglan taog n, kinahanglan tag inputs o kinahanglan taog sum. Okay? So we can, okay, without the formality of formal programming, magbutang tag data type, so we can just place any kanang variables to use. So for example, let us say variable nga n. So n will be starting from 0, no? Comma. So comma is used to separate different items. Okay, so you have I, which is your input, no? And you have your, let us say, the value for your sum. So sa starting value sa imong sum karon, sum is equals to 0. Okay? So mo na siya pinakisipan ana jud og C++ na programming. My God. Anyway, that is your variables that you will be using. You have n, you have your I, and you have your sum. Now, with that, we can use a loop or a for loop or a while loop later. So, of course, ito nag-implement first with a very simple nga kanang while loop. So, by looking at the solution that we are having, as we can see here, if we will be translating this, as we can see that you have the same preparation symbols in there, no? Kay tanawa parehas nga preparation symbols sa imong n, sa imong I ug sa imong sum. Sunod, you have an input sa imong n. Gibali, the size of the input. So you just simply place there unsa may atong syntax sa input. Okay, just place there input I. Okay? Or input n, sorry. Input nimo ang value sa n. Sunod, after having the input for n, you will now have the items necessary for you to code your kanang operations. So as we can see there that there is no such thing as a negative input. So since walay negative input karon, ang imong himuon butangan na nimo siya og checker. So sa atong checker karon, it is an if statement in here. So makita ka na if statement. So main ka karon if n is, as we can see, we have comparison operators in here. So atong comparison operators na dinhi karon. Okay, so comparison operators is that ang iyang precondition walay negative nga value. So main ka karon if n is greater than 0. Okay? So if n is greater than 0, this is your true path in here. Okay? So mo ni karon ang imong true path kung unsa siya ang iyang buhaton kung ang imuhang value sa n kay greater than 0. 1, 2, 3, any positive integer. But kung negative integer siya, ang iyang himuon is wala siya'y himuon sa ubos. Okay? Wala siya'y himuon nga result. So instead, in here, kung na lang may butang comment, and then siya din But in here, within this particular if statement, naa din karon ang imong sunod nga operation na himuon. So unsa may sunod nga operation na niya? You need to check for the value of your n. If it is greater than 0, but now, as we can see sa ato ang gihimo nga solution earlier, or last meeting, is that it is not a simple branching statement. So unsa may iyang gihimo? Dili siya branching statement, nga simple nga branching statement. Ang iyang gihimo is that it will repeat the operation, no? It will repeat the operation until the value of your n will be 0. So both pasabot, ang iyahang value sa n must be positive in order for the loop to continue. So in here, as you can see, naakay kanang condition, no, nga kanang this kanang diamond, which indicates a particular kanang condition kani siya. So now, what you need to do with that particular operation, because this is a particular decision nga symbol, instead of using an if statement, no, di pareha ganina nga if, kung if gani mo agira siya o sort of a branch, murag sanga ba mo sanga siya kung if statement, kani siya karon dili siya mo sanga kundi mo look back siya, mo balik ba. So since it will look back, you will not be using an if statement. Instead, in your kanang guide, you will be using a while statement. Pwede pod for, but kanhi masayon gamiton ang while. Okay? So while statement ang atong gamiton in order for the cycle to occur. Kaya kung if siya, musanga raman siya, pero kung while siya, bubalik-balik siya until a condition is falsified. Now, balik ta. So ang atong gamiton din karon is while. So may ta karon while n is greater than 0. So ako lang kitab, no? Ako lang kitab buka sa kay para maklaro nato kung kinsay member ni kinsa. Okay? So if n is greater than 0, yeah, while n is greater than 0. So samtang kuno ang n kay greater than 0, so unsa may imong himuon sa imong operation. So with that, we can see that you will now accept an input. The input is now the actual value of I that you will be using for processing. So may kakaron, input I. Okay? So once na human nag-input ang imong value sa I karon, you will now be using this input for a particular decision, which is a branching statement. So as you can see here, it is not cyclical. Tanawa ang mga arrows, dili siya cyclical. Instead, it will be going into from the top to the bottom, okay? Or from the top to the side. So, dili siya mobalik. So, since that is the case, it is just simply a sanga, is a branch. So, it will only go from the top to the bottom or to the side. Now, you will be using what is known as the if statement. So, may kakaroon if I modulo 2, so ang modulo mo ni siya karon, no? Tan-aw ninyo din sa inyong guide kani mod, no, modulo mod. So I modulo 2 is equal to equal to 0. Okay? So if I modulo 2 is equals to 0. Now, if it is equal to 0 karon, unsa may imong himuon din ha, no? So if it is equal to 0. Now, if it is equal to 0, you will make an accumulation or a top up or imong kuhaon ng iyang sum. So may karon, sum equals sum plus I. Okay, so man na imong himuon karon sa imong gibali kanang operation. So imong kuhaon ang sum equals sum plus I. And then after that, kung nakahuman na kaana niya karon sa iyang operation, what you will do next is to go into the statement that is false. Okay? So once dili ni siya true, no? O dili ni siya true, ang imong himuon is that dili nimo i-accumulate ang iyang sum. So you will not accumulate the sum. Instead, you will decrease the value of n by 1. So may kakaroon n equals n minus 1. So, but pasabot, imong gikuhaan ang n by 1. Now, regardless if your statement is true or not, but pasabot kung ang imong statement kay true or ang imong statement kay dili true for the value of I if it is an even number, ang iyang himuon is that iyang pagamyan ang value sa n. So that inigbalik niya din sa imong while loop, kani siya din nga block ba? So if you will be looking at here, this block in here, inigbalik niya ani nga while statement, ang value sa n is now reduced by 1. Okay? Kaya kung dili ma-reduce ang value sa n by 1, the while statement will always be true. So but pasabot kung ang imong n kay dili nimo kuhaan og usa, ang iyang himuon is kanunay siya nga greater than 0. So kung kanunay siya greater than 0, dili siya false and it will not exit the loop. So mo ni karon ang imuhang block to perform that particular operation para mo terminate ang imuhang loop. Now, kung nahuman na ni siya karon, nahuman na ni, ibali nahuman na ta. Nahuman na ta sa atong operation, no, nahuman na ta. Human na ta ani niya. So, unsa may iyang himuon sunod kung nahuman na ni siya. So, if that is now finished, no, nahuman ang imong kuan operation dinhi karon. Human na ni, no? Nahuman na ang imong looping structure o ka-execute. So, for example, ang imong size sa input n is 5, di ka 5 ni magbalik-balik. First nimo nga input nga I is let us say 3. So dili siya i-accumulate. Sunod nimong input kay 4, dili i-accumulate siya. Sunod kay 5, dili i-accumulate. Sunod kay 7, dili i-accumulate. Sunod kay 10, i-accumulate siya. So that will be equal to 4 plus 10 equals 14. So karon unsa man ang pinaka-last na process ani niya to indicate that you now have successfully performed the operation. Now, what you need to do is to place a sum. Okay, so ang sum karon is a, as you can see here, a display. So i-display na to ang sum as the final output. So in here, this essentially kani siya no. So essentially kani siya nga atong gihimo. This is, although a pseudocode, this can now be in a way just tweaking a few syntaxes and making certain kanang grouping mga block statements. Kani siya atong gihimo can now be translated into actual programming. So kadto atong gihimo nga pseudocode, it will be easier na to translate into actual programming. Ang importante lang yun, class, you need to remember that you are to analyze the problem carefully. Kaya once gani naana na siya, may exist na siya nga solution karon in terms of its pseudocode or flowchart na namoy idea kung giunsaon na siya pag-solve. Ang pag-implement ana sa programming, dali na lang. Okay? So, mauna siya importante kaayo. And that is the skill that you need to develop. And that skill can be developed when we will be solving many problems. Okay? So, with that, no, it's 12:25, but we can still have maybe room for one example after the end of the class. But for the meantime, let's go to the continuing part of the topic, okay, which is about kanang the history or a brief history of C programming. Now, C programming is actually derived from DCPL or CPL or Combined Programming Language. It was, of course, out of Algol 60 in 1963. So, bot pasabot mo na iyang pinaka foundation ba, pinaka basis of C programming. No, it was improved in 1967. This was actually a very classical language, no? So for the 1960s and mga 1967, 63, this is the time of our mga parents pa, no? And or grandparents during this time, and this was the explosion of, or the kanang kung ang smartphone nato is as popular karon, no, the popularity of smartphone today with our technologies, this was high tech back then in the 1960s ang kaning mga programming languages, because imagine the computers during those times aren't as handy as our computers today. So meaning our kanang atong mga cellphones karon is as big, generally bigger pa gani than a room of mainframes or of computers of of big machines way back in the 60s. So ingana ka ni-improve ang technology through time, no, through the miniaturization of our transistors for mga semiconductors, tungkol sa semiconductor industries na to. But with that, this was very high tech back then. no, kani siyang BCPL. So which is it's based on the B programming. Now C, as a successor of B, no, it's just a series of alphabetical increase ra, mao na siya nganong gitawag siya na C language, was a stripped down version of BCPL. Meaning BCPL during that time has a lot of unnecessary parts of the language that aren't generally used by programmers. So that is why si Ken Thompson at Bell Labs kanang compiled a language for the Unix operating system, for the internal versions of Unix. So in fact, ang Unix operating system is highly tied with C programming because the implementation of Unix is actually coming from C programming. Okay? So with that, C is basically considered today as a middle level language, no, or dili siya not that high and not that low in terms of its kanang features, no, meaning ang C will enable you, C programming will enable you to look up at the actual operations of the machine, but as close to the semantics of English as possible. Meaning, if you will be studying C programming, you will be kanang exposed to how the computer operates or for how our machines operate. But it is not also that disconnected that it cannot implement some high-level features in a particular modern-day scenario. In fact, most of the kanang, let us say, time-critical features of our operating system are actually written in C programming. So, systems programming, yun, C is actually the reigning king in systems programming. Of course, naago ng mga bagong programming run like Rust, but C is still predominantly used because of its kanang time-tested, proven nga applicability. So, nagamit na magud sa dugay, although naagoy mga criticism ang uban sa C programming, no, na sila criticism on how the formality of the language and some mga unnecessary items sa language, but it works through time and it was being tested. It is used to implement operating systems. So that is why C is the reigning king of systems programming. It is also considered a middle-level language because it can be as close as the machine, mabito na kasagaran ng mga embedded systems like Arduino, no? And let us say PIC or programmable interface controllers are implemented in C. So usually implementation din nila na C because of its performance. So if you will be going into performance, no, if you want to squeeze the last speed of the machine or the last speed up of the machine without resorting into very complex assembly programming, then C is the choice for you. Now, ang inyong C programming, no, is actually bundled in the CodeBlocks IDE. Mabita na nga, I will really recommend CodeBlocks IDE. Although you can use other IDEs, no, like Eclipse and Microsoft Visual Studio, no, because of course you can use that, parehara man na sila og mga general features, or you can use the mobile version. But ang CodeBlocks manggod, sa akong experience, it's very good for those who will be starting into programming because of its features available that caters professional and of course not as disconnected as to students. Meaning dili siya nga nakalisod gamiton like kanang kuan some other tools like some other professional nga mga IDE, but it is not also kanang kuan kanang lacking of features that will be used by professionals. So in fact, professionals can use it, but it can also be used by students who are just starting into programming. So you can install this, no, CodeBlocks ka IDE. You just go into this particular site, kaning codeblocks.org. You will be given an IDE plus a compiler. So ipilion na ninyong kanang compiler plus IDE for Windows. Of course, you can install this also. Nano siya available nga kanang installation module for, let us say, the Linux and Mac OS. And after you have installed that, you will open it and you will follow the on-screen instructions. And finally, you can have this IDE here. No, man siya inyong IDE, the code blocks IDE. When you will be starting programming, you will just go into File, New File, and go into C, C++ source code. And finally, select C programming and you click Finish. Then you can now write your first program. Now, going into actual programming na. So these are just the guide, no, in how to perform actual programming. Now, if you will be going into programming, if you will be coding now in that sense, in let us say C programming, the first thing that you need to remember is that you have to follow just a certain tips, no, certain tips in order for you to implement the program properly. Okay, in most of the time that I have seen who are just starting into programming, they will miss the opportunity of actual learning by guessing. Tag-ano naman lang good kung unsay sayo. So, and at worst, if in a face-to-face setting or even not in a face-to-face setting, mangita na lang og hinimo sa uban. So, there's no, I'm not really against kanang mga programs that are written by someone else and you will interface it with your work. But may problema kay even me, I'm doing that. But ang lisod lang ana karon kung nahinimo nga code sa uban, you are interfacing it with your work and you don't know how that operation of that other code would work into your respective code. So, both pasabot karon nga importante naka-understand ka kung in general giunsa pag-work ana nga code kay para maka-design ka sa imong program properly. Nga dili ra siya magpataka kag kay imo nang i-copy paste din na ni gana okay na siya. It's not like that because once you cannot explain what you are making, then in a way you are not having that skill, no, or ability to program properly kung dili ka ka-explain sa imong gihimo. So in the program development life cycle, it will enable you to have that particular guide on how to perform actual programming. So the first is that you need to analyze the program requirements. So unsa may bot pasabot aning gi-analyze nimo program requirements? Unsa may inputs o outputs sa imong kinahanglan. Okay? So unsay inputs o unsay output nga imong gikinahanglan sa imong problem. So karon once nakahibaw na ka unsay inputs o outputs sa imong problem, then you need to design the algorithm. So saan na to pag-design sa algorithm? Either a flowchart or a pseudocode. Now this can be done mentally. If you're already good at programming, you can do it mentally. Meaning na sa imong una-una kung saan na imo pag-program ang imuhang imuon nga algorithm para makasolve sa problem. Sunod, after you have implemented the algorithm, either visually or mentally, you can now implement the algorithm in C. So, implement nimo, pagkahuman nimo mag-implement, compile the errors, and debug the errors before you will make necessary changes. So, ayaw sa kung paghimo og changes kung wala ka kahibaw kung unsay usbon. Sa basin sa sigon nimo usog-usob ang sakto na sayop na noon. Mas may nakahibaw sa ka probably unsay sayop through kanang flag sa imong compiler, then make necessary changes. So, make necessary changes, imong i-debug, then imong i-implement balik ang algorithm, pagkahuman, kung wala na errors, then you will now get the result. So, in a way, if you will be thinking about it, this particular process in here, no, ang designing the algorithm, is what makes or breaks your programming skill. Kana yung pag-design sa algorithm, mo na importante kung unsaon gini mo pag-implement sa imong code. Kaya kung wala gani ning pag-design sa imong algorithm, meaning kung wala gani kay game plan or wala kay nagdagan nga solution sa imong nahuna sa problem nga gihatag, ang mahitabuan na di gyud na ma-implement o programming nga actual programming nga code or in C programming. So importante ang imuhang yung algorithm. Ang imuhang pag-implement sa imuhang code musunod ra na if you have the right design of the algorithm. No? It may not be the perfect design, but if it is going into the right track, of that particular problem, then it can solve that particular problem as fast as possible. Mao mo gani siya ang pinakalingkod nga often neglected. Ang uban mo go into programming, diretso na dayon og kuan into explore into programming, but has weak skills in terms of designing the algorithm. So ang pag-design sa algorithm is very, very important. Now, we still have time. Kuan pa man, 12:38. Let's have another example in terms of pseudocode. No, dili lang tamag kanang kuan. Let's not go into let us say kanang kuan. Let's not go into flowcharts kay medyo langan ni implement ang flowchart. So this is one of the solution that you will be having in terms of pseudocode. Now, how about if we will be having another problem? So, for example, napilain problem na to. Say, determine or count na lang. Count the number of inputs from n inputs that are a factor of 3 and 5. Okay. So, example. Now, ang imong n, let us say 3 lang atong n, size sa input 3. So, your input 1 is, let us say, kuan. So, your input 1 is, let us say, 3. Input 2 nimo karon is 2. And input 3 nimo, last input, is, let us say, 10. No? So, ang imong count is equal to 2. Of course, 3 is a factor, 3 and 5 man din ni. Sorry. 15 na lang ni. Okay, 3 or 5 man dito. 3 and 5, sorry. 1 ra di ay. So, for this particular example, and man di ay operator. Hindi siya or operator. So, with that, ang imong gihimo is basically this one, no? So, you have n, which is the size of your input is 3, no? You have input 1 starting at a value of, given with a value of 3, input 2 which has a value of 2, and your input 3 is 15. So, with that, only 15 satisfy the particular condition that it must be a factor of both 3 and 5. Okay? So, dapat factor siya of 3 and 5 ang imuhang input. So, kana siya nga condition karon, maunay imuhang basis. So, dapat factor siya of 3 and 5. For example, 30 is a factor of 3 and 5. Divisible siya perfectly by 3. Divisible po siya perfectly by 5. Okay? So, for example, kanang 75. Ang 75 is a factor of both 3 and 5. 75 divided by 3 is equals to 25. 75 divided by kanang 5, 50, 25, 15. Okay? So, divisible 15 ang iyang result. So, with that, that is the thing that you need to identify as the necessary items of your program. Now, we will have a pseudocode regarding this program. So, panatang ni example para natay pseudocode yan. So, example. Example ako na-delete. Now, let's have a necessary part of our program development lifecycle first. Analyze the program requirements. So, may mga program requirements na to. First is that we need to have the size of n. Okay? So, n is starting from 0. So, what pasabot, dapat ang imong n is having a value of 0 because this is initially the size of the input. Sunod is the actual input that you're having. So, na siya. So, mga ni karon ay mong mga necessary items. And finally, for your output, you have there the count. So, karon kung imo i-reduce ni siya nga entire statement, imo tan-awon din ha unsa man ang mga nouns that will be used for your input. So, kakaroon count. Ipha ang mga inputs. So, inputs is also a noun. Nagikan sa n inputs. Okay. So, nakoy n, nakoy I, o nakoy count. Or, ato lang butang rinig, C. Starting count is 0 also. Now, once you are finished with that, some of the routines that you will be using, such as checking, is generally the same rapod na siya sa atong gihimo nga problem earlier. So you will say, if n is greater than 0, no? N is greater than 0, this will be the checker of the size of your input, no? Then, if you have already checked if n is equals to 0, or greater than 0 rather, you will now have the actual loop to contain your n is greater than 0. Nganong may makakaroon while n is greater than 0? Because this will indicate that your n is having the size of any positive integer, such as, let's say, 5, and it will reduce by 1 each time you have successfully finished one operation. So may kakaroon, while n is greater than 0, sunod din mong himuon karon is the actual operation that will pertain your kanang counting of the inputs. So, first input n pa dahil nakalimot ko sa input n. So, karon din hinapod ta sa sunod nato din karon ato na pong i-input ang imuhang I, which is the operation that you will be using for your inputting of that particular value. So, input I. So, i-input nimo ang value sa I. After having that particular input nimo sa value sa I, you will now check if your I is a factor of. So, in a way, naani siya pwede nimo gamitan og duha ka kuan. There are a lot of techniques that you can use. You can either use an AND separator or you can use duha ka if statement. Okay? So, let's go to duha ka if statement para na mo idea kung saan na siya. So, pwede natin himo duha ka if statement. The first is to check if your value of I is, if i-modulo nato by 3, it will be equal to 0. Okay? So, bot pasabot, kung ang imuha bang I, if i-divide nato by 3, wala by bugkig. So, for example, 15, i-divide nato by 3. Ang iyahang result is 5, remainder 0. So, ang atong concern karon is ang kaning remainder, dili ang quotient. So, mana, if I modulo 3 is equals to 0. So, but pasabot, kung makalusot siya nga condition, naana po kay condition na nagsunod. So, meaning kung mo lusot siya sa first na test, okay? So, if I modulo 3 is 0, so nilusot siya if it is true, then it will go to the other condition. So sa atong other condition, it will check if the value of your I i-modulo by 5. So gibali, dapat mulusot siya sa first condition, sunod mulusot na po siya sa ikaduha nga condition, which is I modulo 5. So may kakaron, I modulo 5 is equals to 0. So, both pasabot, nga ni ba, first, mura ba siya og filtering mechanism na kung bulusot siya sa first condition, it doesn't necessarily mean na imo nang i-count as a modulo of 3 and 5. Instead, imo pang palusuton siya sa second nga condition kay and man mo divisible by 3 o mo divisible by 5. Perfectly divisible. So, but pasabot, may input nimo 21 modulo 3, 0, lusot siya. Pero ang 21 modulo 5, kay dili man, ang result sa 21 divided by 5, kay 4 remainder 1. So, dili siya, it will not be kuan passing that particular condition. After that, kung nahumana ka ani, dinha pa lang ka mo implement sa imuhang count. Count equals to count plus 1. Okay, so count equals to count plus 1. So diha pa mo implement karon ang imuhang counting plus 1. So kung ma-implement na siya nimo imong counting plus 1, mao na karon ang imuhang himuon nga basis sa imuhang output. Okay? Count din ni C. Count C ram din ni. C equals C plus 1. Sunod, once na humana ni, no, balik ta din hi. Mo-align ta balik din hi sa atong input. Okay. So once na humana gani na siya, ang ato na pong sunod na himuon is to make our value of n starting from any positive integer down to 0. So atong kuhaan ang n og usa. Okay? N equals to n minus 1. Now once that is finished, nahumana na siya, ang atong final output karon is the actual value of your count. So atong i-display karon ang atoang count, which is C. So now, this is the entire pseudocode, no? Muna ni siya ang pseudocode sa atoang problem that indicates to count the number of inputs from n inputs that are a factor of 3 and 5. Then R is R din. Is are a factor of 3 and 5. Now, once you will be, this really requires practice. Once you have this one here, once naanakaani niya nga idea, no? Not that formal in terms of its English-like statements, gamay na lang ni nga modification, just a few steps to modify this particular pseudocode, you will now have a solution for your actual programming. So ma-program na to. Once naa na to siya, karon nimo nga pseudocode, or in a way kung ganahan ka flowchart, pwede ra pod nga flowchart. So next meeting, no, we will now be going into actual programming. But for the meantime, I will be giving learning tasks or assessment for you that will entail to actual pseudocode and flowchart. Okay? So for example, last na lang, napamatay time kami, 10 minutes. So din kita karon no. Ako lang nang i-show window ninyo. So if you will be going into actual programming na class, wala ni siya inyong makitaan. No? Entire screen na lang kayo para hindi siya. So you will now see this here. Nag-load pa. Wait lang a while. Mauna ni siya. You will have your code blocks IDE. Sa kung nang gikaingon, monitor mo sa file, new, file, and you will have go C, C++ source code. You just select C, and you write the full name of your code. Let us say, I will just be going into documents, no, and I'll be just saving it in my VSC yung folder. No? Any folder will do. Asa na ninyo dapat ipumutang siya yung code later. Say 13, and I'll just be saying in here na sample code. Okay, so in there, if it's finished, finish ni mo, then mo na ni siya ang imuhang C nga coded. Okay, so next meeting, we'll be discussing the formality of the programming. Nganong naaman ni siya? Okay, anong naaman ni siya? No? Nganong naaman ni? Sa imong code, sa pag-write sa imong code later. Okay? So, anong naaman ni siyang ingani karon? And you will have your code in here. In here. Okay, unsa man ni silang mga ingani? Na. Unsa man ni mga ingani? Okay? So, we'll be discussing that next meeting. And hopefully, we'll be solving or implementing simple code for you to follow. Because once you have finished this module 1, do not forget this because this is very important. Ato ning i-translate, no? Di lang sa siguro karon because of the kuan. Maybe confused na napoy 8, na napoy double, so may gamit ang mga 8, mga double, mga kuan. So, ato ning i-discuss formally ang language next meeting. And once we will be discussing the language, we will go back into the things that you have foundationally learned on Module 1. Kaya ang kadtong nyo nakatunan sa Module 1, mo na itong himon na basis para maka-write mo og code in C programming dito sa Module 3. Okay? So, don't just neglect this. This is not some certain and important matters kanang ato ang pseudocode o flowchart. Because tagan kong students nga, nakita nga, dili na tagag value ba ang flowchart o ang pseudocode. Okay? So, nag-abot to programming mag-lisod. Actually, kadtong atong gisudocode kanina, as in, gamay na lang kayo kulang, few modifications na lang, to, mura na to siya in actual C programming. Okay? Gamay lang kayo modification. So, that is why it is very important, it is very imperative, no, that you will really develop your skills in flowcharts and pseudocode. Okay? Ang step-by-step solution to solve a problem. Mao na importante kayo. The rest of the programming syntax will just simply follow. Okay. I think that's it for minutes remaining. Napakoy class on the next section or the other section. So unless you have some clarification regarding our kanang you have questions regarding our class for today, na may mga maybe clarification, you can message it na may, I think 6 minutes na lang remaining before I will end this class. So, timan ito ninyo ha, maogi ni siya atong himuon na later on if you'll be going into programming. There are a lot of tools ngayong magamit, but mo lagi na ang tools is just as good as the user, as the skilled. Pwede mo gamit kag multiple actually, no? Pwede na siya. That's one approach. Gamitan ni mo multiple sa imuhang 3 o 5. Pwede siya na imuha siyang kuhaon ang multiple sa tag 15 nga value. So bot pa sa bot, pwede lain approach. Kato lang ako lang ipakita ninyo lain pud approach. Pwede you can have the solution to multiply 3 and 5. Pwede pod. Pagkahuman, ang kadtong sa 3 ug 5, 15 man na, tanan nga mamodulo sa 15. Now, usa ra ka if statement na. Tanan nga mamodulo sa 15 is ang iyahang result is maoy imong gamitan nga i-count as an output. So for example, di ba kanina may kog 3 na koy if for 3 and if for 5. No? Pero you can actually do multiplication of 3 and 5. So that is equals to 15. No? And modulo the input by 15. Pwede po. Usa ra ka if statement imo gamiton. But magipakita lang mo na kung nag-branch ba, duha ka if statement na nagsunod. No? Kaya para later on, if na mo i-implement, makakita mo nga, pwede po din nga ang solution. So there are many ways to modulo to have your own solution. This is just one solution. Falguera. So this is just one of the solution. Your solution is also good, even much better than what I've made. I'm just making it kanang duha ka if statement pa nagsunod kay para makita mo nga pwede siya ing anaon ninyo pag-implement later. This is what is known as cascading of if statement. Kung na kay if diha, nya na po kay if sa ubos, nya na po kay else, igi mo na po ibutang if statement. So nag-cascade ba siya? Pwede na siyang ing ana nga solution so that you can see that it can also perform something like that. Or you can also find your own solution. If it is much efficient, much better, mobitaw na, this is programming. You can make your own solution as long as it will solve the problem with all the possible inputs. So, pwede na siya. Okay mo. Good question, by the way. Any questions pa? Ano po yung mga kuan? You can chat it or you can just simply kuan. Talk in kuan, raise your hand or whatever you want. So muna ha, later on mag-program na ta. This is just the foundation of internship programming. A lot is still on the table for you to do. And later on, you will find programming very interesting. And I will assure you, no, that this really pays well. Not just with kuan kanang compensation, because of course, coders are highly paid, but also with terms of fulfillment, personal fulfillment, labi na sa inyong mga, labi na sa tech industry later on. So, muna, I'm not restricting any solution. Ang basta solution ganing mo work, that's fine with me. Okay, so it's already 12:58. So, I hope you have learned something, no? You can just review the handouts. By the way, ako ning i-post ning inyong solution kaning nasa notepad karon the next maybe after class, after sa akong class this 2 o'clock. Ako nang i-post for you to examine and for you to check and for you to maybe find some even much efficient solution. Okay, no more questions na. Then see you next week. That will be Monday next week. We will be having a new discussion, module 2. Okay? If no more questions, then see you next meeting. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye, sir.
Bye, sir.